All here for the Chimpanzee Divestiture selection process briefing, because that's what we're going to do this afternoon. The briefer is Colonel Jack Blackhurst, and I've been practicing this, so I hope I get it right. He is the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Science, Technology, and Engineering, which he says is he runs the S&T program for the Air Force. So that's fairly easy. He'll have a statement for you, and then he'll answer your questions. Colonel Blackhurst. B-L-A-C-K-H-U-R-S-T.
Yeah, I think she has a press release for you. Good afternoon. I am Colonel Jack Blackhurst, and I have been serving as the project director. Can everyone hear me? Serving as the project director for the Chimpanzee Divestiture effort. We do have some members of our team with us today. I'd like to introduce them to you before we begin. First of all, my boss, Dr. Helmut Hellwig, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Science, Technology, and Engineering here in the Air Force. Beside him is Colonel Dave Lawrence. He is the Chief of Contracting at the Human Systems Center at Brooks Air Force Base, Texas. We have Lieutenant Colonel Denver Marlowe, a veterinarian who supports the Air Force Surgeon General's office. And we have Ms. Marcia Bachman, who also is a lawyer with the Air Force General Counsel, a contracting lawyer. Okay, let's get started. The Air Force has been actively seeking new owners to provide long-term care for its chimpanzees, the chimpanzee colony of over 140 chimpanzees. The Air Force's primary interest throughout this entire effort has been the overall welfare of the chimpanzees. The Air Force is pleased to announce today the award of the chimpanzees colony to two organizations. The first organization is Primarily Primates of San Antonio, Texas, and they will receive 30 chimpanzees for the purposes of retirement. They will retire the chimpanzees. The second organization is the Colston Foundation, located in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and they will receive 111 chimpanzees to be used primarily for research purposes. The Air Force and the awardees were able to negotiate an agreement that was acceptable to the various parties and which will ensure the future well-being of the chimpanzees. The Air Force issued a notice of intent to divest this colony of over 140 chimpanzees 16 months ago in accordance with the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 1997. The Air Force issued a request for proposal on September 30th, 1997, and received 5 written proposals on June 17th, 1998. 4 offerers then made oral presentations during the week of June 29th through July 3rd. These other proposers were Chimp Haven Incorporated of San Antonio, Texas, and the Institute for Captive Chimpanzee Care and Wellbeing Incorporated of Boynton Beach, Florida. The 5th offerer, a private citizen, voluntarily dropped out of the process. The Air Force used a competitive, negotiated process as required by the statute. The information provided in the written proposals, the oral presentations, and during the site visits was evaluated against the 4 primary areas of evaluation as contained in the request for proposal. These were: 1, the facilities and operating procedures; 2, their staffing, technical, and managerial capability; 3, the realism of the offerer's financial capability and their financial plan; and finally, 4, their past performance, their experience with dealing with chimpanzees. The evaluations were conducted by an Air Force team comprised of technical experts from several different functional areas. These included veterinarian medicine, finance, facilities, civil engineering, legal, and contracting. After a careful review of all the elements of the offerer's plan, the evaluation team determined to what degree offerer's proposals met the standards identified in the request for proposal. The Air Force then conducted negotiations with the 2 offerers whose proposals provided the best opportunity to meet the long-term welfare of the chimpanzees. This completes our formal statement. We are available to answer your questions. I ask that you identify yourself and state your media affiliation. Yes?
Clyde Weiss with the Alamogordo Daily News.
Yes.
There has been, from the animal rights community, a lot of criticism about the Colston Foundation for violations of what it contends are mistreatment of the animals in the past, and as you know, the Department of Agriculture has actually fined the Colston Institute. Can you explain how that issue has entered into the decision that still led the Colston Institute to receive the chimpanzee?
Sure. First of all, I would say we evaluated the past performance of all offers. And what we found was we did a statistical analysis of all those agencies in the country that do maintain chimpanzees, and did an analysis to indicate their inspections, their analysis results, and found that the Colston Foundation did as well or better than the other major chimpanzee facilities located in the country. Therefore, we included that analysis as part of our evaluation of the Colston Foundation. Next question?
I'm Jennifer Cousin from Science Magazine. Could you elaborate on what kinds of research the chimpanzees will be used for at the Colston Foundation?
I can't elaborate to what the research that will be used in the future. I can only comment on the research that they have been used in the past, and I think that's been well documented, hepatitis, HIV, and for some breeding purposes. Yes, sir.
Okay, you're splitting up the group 30 and 111.
That's correct.
How is the selection being made? On what, and what's the basis for the selection?
The basis for splitting the group up?
How do you choose which one will go to which organization?
Okay. Dave, do you want to answer that question?
That was basically,
Why don't you come up here?
Could you identify yourself?
that was basically a negotiated process between the Colston Foundation and Primarily Primates. We actually got them together and talked about which chimpanzees were going to go to which organization, and it was agreed by both parties that this, in fact, was how it was going to be done.
Can you identify yourself?
I'm Colonel Dave Lawrence. I'm the Director of Contracting for Brooks Air Force Base, Human Systems Center.
Okay, but the Air Force made the final decision.
The Air Force made the decision with the two parties.
I understand, but can you describe the factors that went into that decision and characterize the animals that went to each organization?
You can't do that without me pulling out an individual description of each individual animal, and I don't have that with me.
Would you be?
Well, was there a uniform standard going throughout the selection? In other words, all left-handed chimps went to one outfit and right-handers went to the other, or something similar to that?
No, there was not a process that says if you were right-handed, you went here, if you were left-handed, you went
Okay,
there.
but all 30 that are going to this one organization, do they share similarities that are different from the similarities going to the other?
The only thing that I know for sure is that there are absolutely no infected type chimps that would be going to primary primates. And so they're all non-infected chimps.
Next one.
Yeah, Barbara Starr, ABC News. Was the care of these animals completely funded by the Air Force in the past? And how much money will, if that is correct, I understand, how much money will the Air Force now save every year?
Okay, I'll answer that two ways. First of all, the care for the chimpanzees back in the 50s and 60s, while the Air Force was doing research, was paid for by the Air Force. However, the Air Force terminated any research it was doing with the chimpanzees in the early 1970s. Since that particular time, it has leased the chimpanzees in return for the care of the chimpanzees. So the Air Force has not budgeted money for the chimpanzees. Essentially what we've done is we have facilities out at Holloman Air Force Base, and we lease those facilities and capabilities to organizations that wanted to use the animals for research, and they provided the care of the chimpanzees while we provided the facilities. So it was a quid pro quo type of relationship.
And does the Air Force have,
So to answer your question, there are no savings associated with that.
does the Air Force currently have any other chimpanzees or animals that it's conducting research on?
The Air Force does have other animals. These are the only chimpanzees that the Air Force owns.
Could you just briefly tell us what other animals you conduct research on?
Although it's not germane to this particular discussion, there are the typical animals you would expect to, the mice that you would expect to have. There are animals down at Brooks Air Force Base that are currently under research purposes.
Going back to the question of the 30, was the number 30 established before the decision of how to break them up, or could you get for us the criteria by which it was then determined that 30 would go to the other group?
There was,
Excuse me, could you just step up to the microphone, please, so they can hear you?
you talking about the actual criteria that determined whether it was 30?
You ended up with 30 that are going to primarily primates. Did that number start at the Air Force, and then you said, okay, you pick you two pick how you're going to divide that up? Or
That
did
was-
you
that was
go
worked
and
out
say
with
there's a
the-
criteria, figure out which ones meet that criteria, and then you'll get those?
That was based on the officer's ability to care for the chimpanzee, as far as the number that they could care for. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to clarify something. The ones that are going then for retirement, none of those are infected animals.
That's correct.
So is that basically the first standard of dividing up the population, that the ones who are not diseased go for retirement? And then do we assume that the other 111 are diseased?
No, ma'am. That was not a basis for division whatsoever. That's not stated in the RFP, and everything that we did was in accordance with our RFP, which is on our website.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just not as familiar with it.
Okay.
How many of the 111 do not have an infection?
I'm not aware
Denver,
of
do you
that
wanna-
myself.
Answer that
But
question.
some of them are not infected.
That's correct.
That's
Yeah.
correct.
There's more than 30, I know, that are, quote, not infected. Okay.
Denver, why don't you answer that question?
Of the over 140 animals, the number of infected animals that were, I don't have that exact number at the tip of my tongue. I've got it in my briefcase. I can dig it out. The 30 animals, as was stated, were going to primarily primates, are not infected animals. Primarily primates indicated in their proposals that they were, whereas they were willing to take infected animals, they were set up primarily to take non-infected animals, and so that was a factor in the consideration.
Not all of the 111.
Not all of the 111 are infected, that is true.
Well, what is that number?
Why don't you get that while we
Okay.
answer some other questions?
Also, if the applicant's ability to care for the chimps was taken into consideration,
Right.
and primarily primates got 30, why didn't some of these other organizations get 5 or 10 or a number that they could care for?
I think the bottom line to that is we were looking at their capabilities that they currently had or had stated in their proposal. Either had currently existing capability or future capability, i.e. within the next year, to provide this type of care. And based on our evaluation, they did not have that
So it
capability.
was just not a matter of finances?
No.
Okay.
That's that question.
you need to change that too.
The group captive chimp,
The Institute for Captive Care of Chimpanzees,
Right.
right.
Can you be specific in any degree as to why they didn't get it? We know that they didn't get the $1 million matching grant. Would that have made a difference had they gotten that?
Well, I guess at this particular point in time, it's difficult for us to go into the detailed proposals because we're just announcing this to the offers, and we'll have the opportunity to debrief them. So I'd rather not get into their individual particular proposals. This guy.
Ted Gideons from Newsweek. What sort of guarantees was the Colson Foundation able to make to prove that they had the financial ability to take care of those animals for the next 30 or 40 years?
Well, the Colson Foundation, just like the other organizations that we received proposals from, we were looking for, from their proposal, basically financial statements of current financial capability that they have and projected financial capability. So we're looking for actual documented evidence that they had financial capability to do this. So typical auditing kinds of data. Yes?
Tom Bowman, the Baltimore Sun. Can you give us any sense what kind of research the chimps were involved in, particularly the older ones, the ones 40 or 39 years of age?
While they were under the Air Force's care? While they were under the Air Force's care back in the 50s and 60s, primarily the research that we were doing at that particular point in time was we were on the advance of the jet aircraft. And so we were trying to learn the human capabilities within the jet engine envelope, if you will. And so they were doing G-forces study, they were doing acceleration studies, they were doing ejection seat studies back then to determine the impact and the human aspect of the man in the cockpit prior to putting him into those conditions.
Has the Air Force ever performed medical experiments on these chimps?
Denver, do you want to answer that question? The question is has the Air Force ever done medical experiments?
In the terms of, you would have to define the term medical, but if that includes physiologic studies, yes. If physiologic, as opposed to the effects of gravity, the effects of acceleration, the effects of temperature, things like that on a living animal, those kind of studies certainly were done. In terms of infectious disease study, the Air Force did not, to my knowledge, conduct active infectious disease programs. Some of the Air Force animals were used on infectious disease studies, but those were generally conducted by CDC or other federal agencies, NIH, FDA, and so on.
So again,
Let me get this gentleman in the back here since. You want to finish? Okay, I'm
so
sorry.
presumably all the older ones, since you stopped in the early 70s, were involved in the ejector seat, G-force studies?
Yeah, I wouldn't
and so
say all necessarily. It depended on the individual chimpanzees.
But you don't know which, from reading this list, was involved in particular?
That's correct.
And the older ones, how many of these are going to be retired? Do you have any sense of which on the list will be the 30 that are going to be retired?
We know which ones are going to primarily primates.
Can you share that with us?
Can I just, while she's
Sure.
answering that, okay, so there's the ones in the sort of 30-plus year range. The younger ones, did they just come into the program later, or are they offspring of the original chimpanzees? I'm just not clear on that. These very young
yeah, let me give you
ones.
some history. Basically, we had the captive care. We had those animals that were actually purchased and brought into the country back in the 50s and 60s. And so that's how you got chimpanzees back then. You purchased them and brought them into the country. Since that time, typically the chimpanzees have been bred. And between the 70s and 90s time frame, the chimpanzees have been bred by the various agencies. And that's how the colony has expanded. Yes.
Back to the animal care issue with Colson. You said that the Colson Foundation had as good, if not better, records in reference to the other large chimp care facilities. Yes. According to the USDA, there's no other facility that's ever been charged twice for chimp deaths. And I'm not sure how that would, I mean, Yerkes doesn't, get charged with the USDA, and LEMSET doesn't exist anymore because of the USDA eventually having to shut it down, and or shutting down because of USDA charge. So I'm wondering what other facilities have had as good records that prompted you to think that Colson is sort of average in that range.
Denver, do you want to comment on that? The analysis that was done with the other facilities?
Your statement that no other institute has ever been charged.
That's what the USDA.
Not according to the director. I've specifically.
Okay, that was misinformation from the.
Right. They have been. Colson Foundation was in fact charged with a formal complaint approximately 3 years ago, and recently again this year another complaint was filed. That second complaint is still under negotiation, so it's not been finalized. We don't know whether or not it'll hold up, and as filed, or whether it'll be amended or changed, or whether it'll even disappear, so the second complaint is still ongoing. As far as the analysis, it's good or better, we went on to the USDA Freedom of Information Act website, looked at USDA inspected facilities that are known to house chimpanzees currently within the past 3 years. We looked mainly at the last 3-year window. And all of those facilities included with the Colson Foundation were also Yerkes, were also New Iberia, University of Southwest Louisiana, the LEMSET facility, which was in existence during the past 3 years, Southwest Foundation for Biomedical Research, San Antonio, Texas, and a couple of others that the only reason they were looked at, it wasn't because they had large chimpanzee numbers, but because they had people affiliated with offers that were presented. We were trying to really take a look at those affiliations and how their past performance had been also.
Do you have the number?
I'm almost there.
Okay.
If I could ask a couple of numbers questions and then sort of a rhetorical one.
Okay.
As I understand it, the colony that's in New Mexico, there are 60 animals that are in the breeding colony, if that's correct. Are all of those animals, or all the Air Force animals, on the premises of Holland Air Force Base, or are some of them in Alamogordo? Because I take it Colston has sort of two facilities there.
That's correct. All the Air Force animals are on Holloman Air Force Base. That's correct.
And
Any facilities that are Colston's facilities are his own chimpanzees.
are any of the, as I understood it, there were 30 animals that are in the special care category. Is that right? And are those the 30 that are going to Texas?
Denver would have to.
Okay, I'll let him count. And the last thing is that,
When you say special care, you're talking about infected animals, for instance, HIV and those
well, I
sorts of
guess, I
things.
just saw it on one of y'all's websites, there were 30 special care animals.
Yeah. Any animals that have been infected will remain with Colston. That's correct. Go ahead.
Based on the spreadsheets in our inventory, these are the numbers, and I'll give an explanation of them each. According to our records, to the best of our knowledge, 23 chimpanzees were exposed to HIV, actually challenged with virus, and 40 animals are known to have been challenged with hepatitis C virus. And another 29 animals their records indicate that they were exposed or used on what was called non-A, non-B hepatitis at that time. And that's we generally, to be conservative, assumed that was hepatitis C. That was before hepatitis C virus was actually identified and characterized. Okay? If you add those three numbers up, some of those animals were actually used on all three of those kind of studies, so it's inappropriate to add all three of those numbers up and come up with a total. If I count all animals on the list that have had one of those three exposures in their records, that comes up to about 77 animals, plus or minus. That is based on a screen of their medical records. That it would be subject to, possibly that number could be changed or differ if they were all screened again today with the most state-of-the-art techniques. But none of those animals went to the primarily primates. Those are all remaining with Colston, and Colston Foundation is in fact equipped and capable of handling infected animals and has the appropriate biosafety level and staffing to handle those animals, and have been for the number of years.
Which of these particular chimps are going to be retired, do you know?
The deeds have been signed in terms of identifying which, the number of chimps are going to primarily primates by name, by ID number. I don't have that list. Colonel Blackhurst?
Do you know if the majority of them were very young or very old?
Can you tell us if any of these are survivors from the acceleration or G-force studies related to the jet aircraft? Or all of it?
According to when I put together the list and the inventory and characterized the disease status and the experimental history of the chimpanzees, I tended to lump the non-infectious disease research, which was all the physiologic research, the G-forces, temperature, acceleration, and all that kind of stuff, into a non-infectious disease category because they didn't have a potential public health hazard, affiliated with them. Of those chimpanzees that were used in non-infectious disease research, let's see, 85 animals out of the 140 plus Air Force animals have a history of having been used on those kind of experiments.
What kind of facilities has the Colston Foundation promised to provide for the chimps as compared to primarily primates? In other words, are they going to be in cages, or what's the setup?
Yeah, I guess that goes back to the detailed proposals. At this particular point in time, I'd like to not address their particular proposals.
On that question, you've got the Air Force facilities. Are you keeping those? Are they getting them?
None of the proposers proposed ownership of the Air Force facilities on Holloman Air Force Base. They all proposed facilities off the base, their own facilities.
Does that mean the facility at Holloman will be closed?
What that means is the next step after the transfer of ownership, which has occurred, is we will begin to negotiate the transfer of the animals off of the base to the two organizations. At such time, when the animals are all removed, the Air Force will then make a disposition decision on its facilities.
Timetable for that?
Well, the lease that we currently have with Colson is good through September 30, 1999. I don't believe any decision will maybe be made before then. I think you're looking in year 00, or probably as far as 01.
What about primarily primates? How soon will they take actual possession of the 30?
That'll be up to primarily primates. Theoretically, Colson has the chimpanzees until 30 September 1999. That's the lease, and the proposals were all subject to that lease. However, if primarily primates negotiates with Colson to get them earlier, that's up to them. Yes, sir.
Just two things, both of them related. The animal rights community has been extremely critical of Colston.
That's correct.
Inevitably, I suspect that they will react and say that this was exactly the wrong thing to do and these animals will be subjected to further horrors. One, what's your response to that? And two, in the best of all possible worlds, wouldn't it have been better to simply take these animals and let them retire in some fashion? Would that not have been the thing you would have preferred to do?
Well, I guess I would answer that first by saying that we did have legislation which had specific parameters, which gave us, the Secretary of the Air Force, the authority to retire or continue the animals for research purposes. So that was specifically in the statute, so we had to comply with that. As far as the animal rights individuals and groups that will have a reaction to this, I guess I would say that the Air Force going into this particular event had no preference as to whether the animals were retired or continued for research. We gave each offer, or any offer that came to us, the opportunity to convince the Air Force that they had the capability and the wherewithal to take care of the chimpanzees. So I would say in my response to that is we gave everyone the same opportunity, and the burden of proof was on the offer to convince the Air Force they had the capability. Yes, sir.
Two questions. Is there any limitations on the type, character, or extent of the research that Colson can perform on the animals that they're being awarded?
I think the statute only said scientific or medical.
Okay. Was there any gender, age, breeding capability, or general health characteristics considered in determining which of the animals, which of the 30 animals are going to the other organization?
I don't believe so.
The two officers sat down and went over profiles of each animal and then agreed on which animals would be transferred.
Was there any uniform characteristic of the 30 that were selected? In other words, there are different genders, or different ages, and different general...
Yeah, I guess the characteristics of the 30 that are going to primarily primates, the majority of them are females. I believe there are 5 males. I believe that's correct. They're primarily older. The average age is 27, which means that about half of them are over 30 years old. And the remainder are somewhere between 5 and 30 years old. That's just a demographic profile of. Yes, ma'am.
Just as a follow-up to the point you made in response to an earlier question that you had no preference deciding between
Yes.
research institutes and
Yes.
retirement. So are you saying then that you really are not at all swayed by the comments, not only from animal rights activists, but also from academics who are studying primates in the wild and in captivity and recognize that these animals
The bottom line of
Yeah.
this particular activity was the Air Force was looking for the best long-term care of the chimpanzees, the organizations that had the wherewithal to provide that, whether they be an animal rights organization or a research organization. We really didn't have a preference. They just needed to prove their capability to take care of the chimpanzees. Yes, sir.
You gave a sort of brief profile of the animals that are going to go to Texas. Do you know if any of those are of the oldest animals that were used in some of the experiments in the 50s and 60s?
I would just say that that's probably true. I think 2 of those are 40 years old, so a good indication are that they probably were. But without checking specific records.
That would be Robin and Penny, right?
Pardon me?
That would be Robin and Penny.
The 40-year-old ones, yes, that's correct. But without checking the records, I couldn't be absolutely correct.
Can you in general describe what the primarily primates is? You know, what do you have
Primarily
there?
primates is essentially a retirement sanctuary. It's been in existence for over 2 decades. I believe it started in 1978. It has, I believe, over 800 animals, I believe.
It's the oldest.
And it's the oldest and largest primate sanctuary in the United States.
How many acres, do you know how large it is?
I don't have that. Do you have that, Dave?
Approximately 10 to 15 acres.
You know,
10 to
how
15
many of the
acres?
18 are chimpanzees? 800
Pardon me?
are...
We know that they have 40 chimpanzees currently.
Is there a facility outside of San Antonio somewhere?
Where exactly is it located? Denver? We actually visited the site.
The primarily primates facility is located northwest of San Antonio, Texas, Leon Springs, in the vicinity of Leon Springs.
Any other questions?
Any limitation on permitting breeding? Or, I mean, is primary...
No
primates-
limitation that we're aware of. That's correct.
I'll wait for the list, but I'm wondering, is the animal Little Minnie, which is a descendant of Minnie, one of the 3 that was trained for space, staying in New Mexico or going to Texas?
My understanding is it's staying in New Mexico.
Could you explain that again? What?
He asked about Little Minnie,
Okay. The
one of the
baby.
descendants of Minnie. My understanding is it's staying in New Mexico with Colston.
I might ask a question. There was some criticism about Colston having the inside track because they had control over an existing $1.2 something million fund from the government that was taking care of these animals. Did that in fact play a role in this, or other assets that the Colston Foundation have make a difference? In other words, if that did make a difference, then it would seem they did have an inside track, because the other organization was complaining that they had no access. There was no way they could get access to that fund.
First of all, I would say that we looked at the total financial capability of each offer, which would include all funding capabilities with the offer.
But you did not consider the possibility that fund could have transferred with the chimpanzees? That was never
Are
really...
you referring to the endowment
The
fund?
endowment. It was a question of transferred with the chimps.
Yeah, the endowment fund, I don't know if that was specified as a separate characteristic in the financial capability that they looked at. But our understanding is obviously that doesn't belong to the Air Force, and that was, any endowment funds were between NIH and Colston Foundation. So we had no jurisdiction over those funds. Any other questions? Thank you very much.